make it tonight. If you look at the readings carefully and keep in mind that we know that it's a lot of reading and you may never get to read it right now, but subsequently you should really tackle it because they do profoundly connect certain threads, one of them being the transnational aspect of the struggle. Whether you're speaking about Martin Luther King, and we'll talk about that, or you talk about Malcolm X, or you talk about any of the particular phases and points of the struggle of the Black liberation movement and its international framework, whether it was actually framed that way or not, it was definitely present. And so we will focus on the transnational aspect of the struggle. Also today, we use the terminology intersectionality. And that is very important in our discussion today because we will see whether we're speaking about Claudia Jones, or we're speaking about Martin Luther King, or we're speaking about Malcolm X. We will see intersectional realities in different focuses. Gender, class, race, national identity, international questions. You will see the intersectionality of it as we have come to understand this term today. And the most important thing, of course, self-determination. How that was shaped, how was that framed, how was that carried out, how was that perceived, and how was that articulated. We will have, and we'll try to really cover the broad spectrum of these questions. And then, of course, the very nature, character, contributions of the Black liberation struggle, the Black liberation movement, whether you define it within its early phase of fighting for the democratic franchise within U.S. society as the civil rights movement framed it, or as the Black liberation movement, Black power movement framed it, going beyond the contours and the national boundaries of the U.S. So we will have that little bit of a discussion, hopefully, and whether we are able to fully complete that discussion, definitely in the readings, and we think that you will see many of these issues amplified and clarified and even raise more questions in the political process that we hope that you will begin to engage and expand upon and develop further. I did want to make one note that one of the readings that we forgot to list, and I think it's a very important reading and it's really very succinct, and that is by Robin D. Kelly, a well-known professor, historian. We did list the article that he co-wrote on Black Like Mao, which is we'll talk about. But he also wrote a book many years ago called Freedom Dreams. And it also is really a powerful elucidation of how the question of freedom was perceived, conceived, developed, and even, of course, dreamed. And he talks about the problems and limitations and also the subsequent development of it. So this book is called Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination. We'll post it on the site so you can get it. Really, I would recommend reading the whole thing. So, without further ado, we want to introduce our guest tonight, Mr. Phil Hutchings. Phil is a veteran of the Southern Freedom Movement of the 1960s. One of the early leaders and organizers of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the very key instrumental organizations of the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power Movement, and the Black Liberation Movement. And also an early activist and member of the Venceremos Brigade, which was a project to break the blockade of Cuba, which entailed organizing contingents from the U.S. to contribute in the limited capacity as North Americans can. It was a disaster trying to cut sugar. But nevertheless, it was obviously a very important solidarity measure. And today we have similar measures of delegations going to Palestine, for example, although not necessarily working, but definitely breaking the narrative and the misinformation. And he was a very early member of the Venceremos Brigade, to speak about that. And also a co-founder and present leader, or one of the leaders of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and I'll leave it for Phil to elucidate on that.
Well, thank you. How's the sound?
Good.
Okay. Glad to be here. A little awed. I haven't been into a university class in quite a while, but I'll do my best. And since this is a university class, and Rabab gave me a hard time for not answering her emails around reading, I actually came with some suggestions. And so anybody who wants to write these down can. Unfortunately, I apologize for not putting them in some type of written form, printed form beforehand. But these are books primarily about the civil rights movement, Black liberation movement, and particularly the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The first one is by somebody who most of you probably know, Howard Zinn. And it was an early book written in the early 60s called The New Abolitionists. And it's a nice small book too. It's easy to read, and it basically covers the early history of SNCC, pretty much the years 1960, 61, 62, maybe 63. But it was the first book that was written about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And probably in any good used bookstore, you can probably pick it up, or it may be online. The second book is more of a larger, bigger thing, and it's written by James Forman, who was the former executive secretary of SNCC from 1961 through 1966. And then he went on to other things, the Black Workers' Congress, the Black Manifesto. And this is basically a biography, I should say almost an autobiography of his life. But in the process, he tells a really good story about SNCC and the history of SNCC. And it's called The Making of Black Revolutionaries. The Making of Black Revolutionaries. And that could still be found also at different, I've seen it at several bookstores, Moe's over in Berkeley, Green Apple out in, I guess, the avenues here in San Francisco. And that's a little bit more meaty, but it's worth it. Third book is a book called, where is it? It's called, one I read, it came out a few years ago, and I saw it over at Moe's in Berkeley, and I think it's other places. It's called The Shadow of Our Youth. And I'm trying to get the author here. Resources. And where is it? Here it is. It's subtitled The Remarkable Journey of the Civil Rights Generation. And what it does more than anything else is to reinforce the fact that this was a youth movement. That most of us who were involved at the time were in our 20s, maybe a few were in their early 30s, but by and large, some people were just getting out of high school and getting into the movement. And so he follows about 7 people who were activists in SNCC, Julian Bond, Stokely Carmichael, Bob Moses, John Lewis, Bob Zellner, Diane Nash, unfortunately the only woman he really focuses on. But it's a good story, and you get to see it almost from their standpoint. The next book is called Ready for Revolution, and that's by Stokely Carmichael. And it's in paperback, and it's probably accessible. And what's really exciting about the book, even though he was telling it to somebody, a guy named Mike Felwell, who actually wrote the book, because he was in the process of dying. So he was almost doing it from his hospital bed. Is that you feel, when he describes different encounters, he makes you feel you're right there. At the demonstration, at the rally, in the room, at the meeting. And so if you want to feel like what it felt like, Stokely's book is the excellent book on that level. 2 more. One is called I've Got the Light of Freedom. And this is the academic book, but a very good one. It's probably one of the better ones. It's talking about the organizing tradition in Mississippi. And he gets into what was the strategy of SNCC, what was the strategy of other civil rights organizations, What did we actually do? What successes did they make? What were the setbacks? We call local people, but by a guy named Robert Dittmer. But if you had to buy one, not buy, but read one on the movement in Mississippi, that's probably the one. And so finally, since I know this generation doesn't have the history of being great readers, like earlier generations like my own, I brought you one book you could actually look at. And this is written by Muhammad Ahmed, also known as Max Stanford. And he is, well, it was and he still is a legitimate activist. And he was one of the founders and activists in a group called the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM. And what he does is he looks at what he calls, and I agree with him, the 4 key black organizations of the 60s. And his own organization, the Revolutionary Action Movement, 2, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, 3, the Black Panther Party, and 4, the League for Revolutionary Black Workers. And he gives an assessment. So the part that's thick is probably somewhere about maybe 60 pages. That's, you guys can handle it, can't you? It's not like the Foreman book, which is about 400 pages. And so I highly recommend it. Each book has a few little glitches in it, and sometimes you can see, looking at history, books from history, that if you weren't in the organization, sometimes you can have a really good analysis, chronology, but you'll miss a few things and make a few things wrong. On the other hand, for people who are in the organization, sometimes you're a little too close to it. And so you can't be as objective enough. So there are little glitches in all these, but when I thought about what would people who wanted to know something about this period, this organization, and some of the other organizations in the period, these were the ones I thought would be best. Yes, Imako. The last one?
Yeah.
This one is...
We can do it during the break. And
yeah, 12. Yeah, We Will Return in the Whirlwind, Muhammad Ahmed, and I've seen it several times over at AK Press in Oakland. And I think Modern Times had it, and maybe some other bookstores as well. Okay, enough books. Let me say something about myself, how I got involved. I come out of Cleveland, Ohio, the Midwest, and I went to college at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And while I had heard about the civil rights movement before I got to Howard, even actually joined the youth chapter of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1960. And that was the beginning of the sit-in movements, and we didn't have upfront Jim Crow segregation in Cleveland. So it wasn't like the sit-ins in the South, but we wanted to show solidarity. And so what we did is we had pickets in front of the dime stores, the Woolworths, the Kresge's, there was one more, Neisner's. And we just picketed out front. And that was a little bit too raunchy for the elders in the NAACP, and they kicked us out. And so we kind of knew that we had to do something else. And so for me, it was my senior year. I ended up going out of Cleveland and going to Howard. And it was in 1960. And I always say that 1960 was a great year to be there for a lot of reasons. Number one, it was the capital. And so all kinds of a country. So all kinds of people come into Washington who would never get out to Ohio. Foreigners, delegates, diplomats. It was also the year that you had a presidential election. And you had John Kennedy, who was running for president against Richard Nixon. We got to meet both of them up front. I got to see Richard Nixon, as close as she is. And after the second televised debate, John Kennedy came to the chapel at Howard University. He brought Jacqueline, which was a big thing. And we were all kind of crunched together into the chapel. And here was the future president of the United States. And so those things almost became natural in a place like D.C. The other thing I liked about Howard was that, though I didn't know it before I left it, I mean, while it was predominantly African-American school, and still is that it had a large amount of foreign students. And what was interesting is the foreign students were basically from 3 places, none of them Europe. When we thought about foreign students, you think, oh, there's some French students, or folks from Germany or Austria. And these folks were from the newly emerging African nations, who were becoming independent, some of them in the 50s and some in the early 60s. A bunch came from the West Indies, Jamaica, Trinidad, and the islands who had been either French colonies, Dutch colonies, or part of the British Commonwealth, and were also, like Jamaica, beginning to move. Guyana, we met people like Walter Rodney, who was a young activist from Guyana, who would get killed eventually, assassinated, better word. And the third place, which was interesting, and I never quite understood why they came there, or why they were basically programmed, is the State Department handles all this, were from Iran. And which in terms of what they subsequently happened in the years after that, the 60s and the 80s, and even in the present, getting to know people from that part of the world, hearing their own analysis, a lot of them were radicals in their home countries, was also a real education. So there were a lot of things on getting educated in Washington, D.C. People coming through, meeting people you'd never meet in other parts of the country that I felt really a beneficiary of. The other thing I would say is that at the time, the student government was beginning to get active, and because there was a movement beginning to happen in the South. And so I was involved with the student government, and we used to raise money to send food and clothing to people who were being thrown off their land in Mississippi because they dared to register to vote. And so the movement was very close and very there. I would say one last thing, and then I'll shut up on this piece, is the geography. Washington, D.C. is something like this. It's a rectangle. It's really actually a square. And it's surrounded on three sides by Virginia, which at that time had racial segregation. And on the other side, it's surrounded by Maryland, which at that time had also official segregation. So the South, even though it was not what we call the Deep South, was very present. And segregation was not something that was abstract or academic. And so that helped me get involved very quickly, early. We went to Northern Virginia, which is now part of Metro Washington. And the theaters were segregated. Black people could only come on the weekends. And when they came, they had to sit up in the balcony. They couldn't sit downstairs. And so, of course, we went and protested. And then, in terms of Maryland, there were two major places. One was Route 40, which was just a highway route going from Virginia through Maryland up north. But they had a lot of motels on the strip for people who really had business in Washington but didn't want to stay or couldn't afford Washington, D.C. hotels, even in the early 60s. You can imagine what Washington hotels are today. And but they were having problems because of this official segregation, because a lot of African diplomats stayed at some of these places as well. And as far as the local whites were, all black folks, were being discriminated. So the State Department kind of came in and used their heavy hand and said, look, could you make an exception here? I mean, the integrity of the United States is at stake, blah, 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 blah. So one of the African students, his name was Alphonse Okuku, who was a relative of Tom Mboya, who was the Labor Secretary of Labor in Kenya, and at that time seen as a future president of Kenya, which actually, unfortunately, never happened. Alphonse came to us and said, hey, you guys, why don't we all dress up in dashikis? and some of you African Americans who can't maybe do an African accent, you just kind of be in the chorus, lip sync, So we all dressed up in dashikis, went up and down Route 40 for about 2 months. And the State Department went crazy, and so they said the whole area, interstate commerce, should basically be segregation free. It wasn't the whole state of Maryland. It was the whole state, the whole part of the interstate. So I just said that because that was some of my early stuff getting involved. And we had a group in Washington, D.C., which was a student affiliate of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and it was called NAG, which was a very appropriate name, because we NAG. It was a Nonviolent Action Group, and we protested, we demonstrated. One of my favorite ones was in May of 1964, George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, was running for president of the United States. Some people may remember that. And he came to Cambridge, Maryland. Cambridge is the eastern part of Maryland, and it's not like Baltimore or Annapolis. It's like really rural, and it reminded people of Mississippi in many cases. Of course, the state police came out, and we ended up being tear gassed. And at the time, I was in ROTC, which we had to be as part of the school because we got federal money. So I was so happy I could go to class the next day. It would in my having tear gas stains all through my clothes and sit up and paint, just smell up the whole ROTC class for my demonstration. But that was kind of like my beginning. And at Howard, because it was kind of in Washington, which was kind of a little middle part between the hardcore South and going north, like New Jersey up to New York. And a lot of people who were in the South sometimes wanted to get out of the South because it was such a pressure cooker. So they come through Howard, we hear the stories of the demonstrations and the rallies and what people did. And what I guess got me started was that these were, a lot of times, we were running to high school students, like from Maryland, Virginia. Here I was in college, and I was studying Government 101 and state and local government, this and that, and reading these big books about this. And these young people were basically challenging the laws in Maryland and Virginia and frequently winning and changing history. So it was like, why should I basically study and stay in school and wait the rest of my life to be able to be relevant in the social change movement when they're high school students, younger than me, who are going out and doing this stuff right now. So I said that because that changed my life in terms of how I looked at my progression in life. Because a lot of my progression coming up as a middle class person or a part of what was a black petty bourgeoisie in Cleveland was that I was supposed to go to college, maybe find a nice girl, get married, of course join a fraternity, and start raising a family, and maybe go get an advanced degree, a master's or something. But then maybe somewhere when I'm in my 30s or 40s, there's this phrase called noblesse oblige, that if you've been given a lot and had a lot of opportunities, you should give back. And so somewhere maybe when I'm in my 30s and 40s, I should basically give back to the society and do something relevant. And what I realized is you don't have to wait half your life to give back. You can start, and as I say, I saw these high school students doing it right then and there. And like some of the Black Lives Matter people, they have no fear. They were doing it. So why shouldn't I do something, get involved? So our group in NAG became a kind of engine for social change. We never got recognized at Howard University, which I think was a blessing, because it allowed us to go out to other universities in DC, Catholic University, George Washington, Georgetown, Dumbarton, and build a citywide movement, as opposed to hanging in our little area of Howard University. So sometimes the misfortune can actually add something positive to your struggle. So I got involved, and a lot of the people who I knew in NAG also would go down in the summer to Mississippi and do that, and they'd come back in the fall and go back to their classes. And then some people would drop out for years. And eventually that's what I did. I dropped out for 11 years. Obviously, I'm from the Midwest. We're kind of slow compared to the East Coast, West Coast folks. So it took me 14 years to graduate from Howard, get my BA. But it was a good 14 years because what I realized the learning I got, being in places like Mississippi, my mother's side of the family is from Tennessee, small towns around Memphis, and my father's side is from Georgia, Macon, Georgia. Is getting to see a little bit of my family history, where they're from, what was happening in those areas, was much more than any kind of book knowledge. I'm not trying to totally put down book knowledge after recommending you some books a few minutes ago. But it was entirely better than I could get anywhere else. You get to meet people who are active in the movement. I remember being in Mississippi and meeting people like Fannie Lou Hamer, and being in meetings with her, seeing how she inspired people, seeing how she talked to people. And what I learned is that here I am, a college kid, and people expect me to have these big words. Oh, look at Mr. Hutchings here, throwing out these $half-dollar words and all that. But that's not the way people talk. And so to really begin to figure out how to organize people is you had to spend some time looking at what they were doing, what their lifestyles were like, and so on. So that's enough about me. And so I wanted to use the rest of the time to say some things about SNCC. And I must admit, in doing this outline, I scared myself. Because I realized I actually did an outline for a book. Not when I intended to do it like a half-hour conversation. So somebody will bug me on that one day. Anyway, about SNCC. What I wanted to start out with was, one could look at SNCC. SNCC basically was an organization of the 60s. It began, well, it actually, let's see, effectively it started February 1st, 1960. That was the beginning of the Senate movements. And though we didn't actually organize a SNCC conference until April 1st in North Carolina, and we formed an organization. And it was called, interestingly enough, the Temporary Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Temporary, because we thought this was not going to last very long. We're going to knock this out real fast. And of course that proved us wrong, but it just showed where we were at. And we brought together a lot of the students who had been demonstrating. And what I find fascinating right now about some of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that are happening, it revives me very much of that period, that early period of the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, when people were doing pop-up sit-ins all over the South. First it started with the black students in different places, and then the white students picked it up, and it started in North Carolina, and next thing you knew it was in Georgia, and mostly in the urban areas, but it basically went to South Carolina, and a couple places, not too many in Alabama, and but it was like everywhere. It was popping up. It was very uncoordinated, but no one saw that as a big problem at that moment, and it was happening. It was throwing people off. People being the officials, they didn't know how to deal with this new phenomenon, particularly in the South, and it was very effective. So that was kind of like the first period of SNCC, and so we formed as a coordinating committee, basically to coordinate all these activities that were happening, because at a certain point people were getting arrested. We needed lawyers. We needed legal money, defense money to get people out. We needed to have better communication between people who were demonstrating here and people who were demonstrating there and another place. So there needed to be some kind of coordinating group. And so the major groups were people who had been at Fisk University demonstrating. A man named Reverend James Lawson had been teaching people some of the key fundamentals of nonviolence. He's still going strong today. He's in his 80s down in LA. Yeah, recently he was here in Oakland, the Bay Area. He has a brother, Phil Lawson, who's here in Richmond, up in Richmond area. Both coming out of the ministers, very strong in nonviolence. And so the Fisk people, and they had good student leadership. Two of their key leaders who would become nationally known. Well, one was a guy named Marion Barry. And Marion Barry became the first chairman of SNCC. He also later, people may remember, he became the mayor of Washington, D.C. And he was the one who unfortunately got caught doing crack cocaine while he was mayor. But he lived to get his revenge. He came back, he got elected to the city council, and he was very much a people's mayor. And the other person was a woman who also is a little bit legendary. Her name is Diane Nash. And she lives in Chicago. And she was very militant in the nonviolent struggle movement. And there's this great little short story, a vignette, about Diane and Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time, was getting concerned about all this happening down in Nashville. And all this kind of disorder. We call it creative disorder, but they call it just plain disorder. And so he sent down Burke Marshall, Assistant Attorney General, to kind of cool things out. And Burke Marshall told Diane Nash and folks, you guys could get yourself killed. And she says, we're prepared to do that if it takes that. And so he reported back to Robert Kennedy about what had happened. And Bobby Kennedy allegedly said, and who in the hell is Diane Nash? And that became a real story. But Diane continued in the movement and is now living in Chicago, where she's been the last bunch of years, and she's active there. And so a lot of that was where the early leadership came from. We had a group that went from Howard, other universities, particularly from the Atlanta area, and some from Xavier, down in New Orleans came. And that became the basis of the early SNCC. So, I'm not going to give you a detailed history. This is the period of the sit-ins, the beginning of the organization of SNCC, the setting up the coordinating committee, structural leadership, the chairman, steering committee, and also we were still doing this debate between do we want to do demonstrations or do we want to do something else like voter registration, and that became the first big debate in the organization, and it was almost very divisive because some people wanted to say, well, maybe we should just set up two separate organizations, one which could do the direct action, and the other that could do the political registration. I might say that direct action obviously is much more flashy, and it's more interesting, and people get arrested, you get a newspaper, and you get in jail, but you get out. And we used to sing freedom songs, which some of you may have heard some of the freedom songs. And the jailers would go mad, they'd be glad when we got out of jail because we would be calling singing from one cell to the other. And there's not time here to say how inspirational that was, because when you're locked up by yourself and you don't know what's going to happen to you, to be able to shout out in a song and hear some answer from around the corner of another cell, and people start singing all over in the jail, and all of a sudden you feel like that. I'm sure that happens with political prisoners, some form of that all around the world, and so that happened with definitely with SNCC. So that was an early period, but what happened is that, and this is part of who SNCC was, is we listened to who we saw as our base, or trying to be our base, and that was the people that we were trying to organize. And some of the people in Alabama and Mississippi said, this is all nice and good, but it's dangerous. And we don't want to expose our people to unnecessary dangers, especially given the situation when they have all the army, they have the law, they have the judges, and if that doesn't work, they have the Ku Klux Klan at night to come and do the night riding. So how can we do something different? And so they said, you guys are going to be here, maybe not all your lives, you're going to be here for a period, and then you're going to go back home or somewhere else. And we're going to live here all our lives. What we need is political power. And we need something, we need to vote, because we can't vote here in our places. And so we need something that will be a legacy of all this organizing that you do right now, which is great, but we need something lasting. And so that's when the arguments within the organization began to develop that we needed to have something more long-term, and it's also something that was rooted in the base of the people, which was basically voter registration. And so basically SNCC goes into the voter registration period, which is pretty much the period from 63 to 65. And people may have heard of a guy named Bob Moses and afterwards. And the Linsky style mainly came out of the labor movement, where you basically had campaigns, you had timetables. You come into an organization and say, well, this is, what is this? This is April. By September, we want to have so many key leaders that we've developed. We want to have some campaigns that will get on the ground by September and come up with some results and victories by October, November. And that's how they organize. That's how the PICO network out here in California organizes today. Or the different San Francisco Organizing Committee, and so on. Our style was quite different, and it was very low-key. It was not dramatic. It was basically to go into areas, because people didn't know us, and we weren't about to tell people what they should do, particularly in an area where they could get killed very easily. And we purposely chose the hardest places to go, like Mississippi. And people remember the Nina Simone song, Alabama's bad, Tennessee's awful, Mississippi, and what we tried to say is that what's happening in Mississippi is a microcosm of what's happened historically in this whole country, in terms of the genocide of the Native Americans, the slavery of African Americans, and the stealing of half of Mexico to become part of the Southwest. And so it seemed like the appropriate place to confront America with the morality of what was going on in this country in the 1960s. And the enduring of racism, we call it a new word, actually, in many ways, the word racism really wasn't used much before 1966. There was a word called racialism that came out of the British Empire. But racism, people talked about, I mean, I grew up in the 50s, talked about prejudice. We talked about the more individual. This is a bad person, they're a bigot, and blah, 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 blah. But we started to say, well, those people exist, to be sure. But that's not our focus. We're talking about the institutions that run this country, that maintain a system of Jim Crow laws, and come out of slavery, but also come out of the capitalist development of the country, which basically used the South as a part of getting the beginning capital that went all over the country, which the whole country benefited from. So that was our kind of ideological approach, and which made us radical to begin with. And we were students, but many who, as I say, went back and forth to school, but many dropped out and became permanent. And so in some ways it might have been more appropriate to say we were a youth movement, with some seniors, of course. And I can't really, I talked about this debate between direct action and voter registration. One of our founders, a woman named Ella Baker, who lived in New York and became active with Martin Luther King, had been at Highlander, the school in Tennessee, which had trained a lot of activists like Rosa Parks. And she'd been a secretary for Dr. King and numerous other folks, and usually in the background. But she said that she really wanted to see a youth organization that was independent, that was not going to be the youth organization of some other group. Because Dr. King wanted this new grouping of people, all these citizen people who have all this energy to become part of the SCLC, the Civil Christian Leadership Conference. The Democratic Party, by the way, was also kind of looking into the background saying, oh, these folks could register future Democrats, voters in Mississippi and Alabama that would vote Democrat. So there were all these little things in the background that were but we said we wanted to be independent. We wanted to let people make up their own minds on what they wanted to do. And so that was the period that we were kind of making ourselves known in the organization, in the civil rights movement, I should say, beyond just our own organization, but we were consolidating who we were as an organization. We basically went around and it's like starting with Bob Moses, we'd go to a town and we'd talk to people. And what we always realized is that there were people who had come before us, people who had lived in the South all their life, people who had tried things in the 50s, in the 40s, and who maybe had minor successes, and maybe they failed, maybe they paid with it for their lives. But they were the people whose shoulders we stood on. And we felt we had to understand that because that impacted the psyche of the people who lived in those areas. And it helped determine whether they would want to organize or why they were scared, because they had never seen people basically rebel and live and be able to survive. And so that was the climate that we came in. And it was important to understand that and let people know we understood that we were not going to try to get them to do anything that would basically be overly risky to them individually. And at a certain point, because it was a situation where it was easy to be risky. I mean, you could look at a white person the wrong way. In fact, you try not to look at them in their eyes, or if you're walking down the street and they're coming, you step in the dirt and they walk on the sidewalk. I mean, it was a situation where something could happen any moment. Really interesting that the only people who kind of really get this, what the fear was like that I've talked to in later years, were people who were in the jungles in Vietnam. Because they had, obviously, they could fight back because they had guns. But the point being is that they were in a situation where you never knew what would happen next. That they could get ambushed at any moment. There could be a pit they'd step in. The Vietnamese, with their great incredibility and creativity, even got the bees to attack the American soldiers based on their sweat glands and using stuff. And so they were always in danger. And we realized that that was true for us too. We looked at the wrong way. A lot of us stood out. We didn't look like the average folks there. I certainly didn't look like the average Mississippi person in Mississippi. And so there was always danger. And it was very hard. That's why a lot of people wanted to get out of there, like on the weekends, or go over to New Orleans or some places. because it was like being in a pressure cooker. It was necessary being in a pressure cooker, but it was part of our action. At the same time, it had effects on us. And so, I mean, half the time I was scared when I was there, and we had to find ways to deal with that fear. And I can talk about that more later, or if people could ask about that. Because I thought about it a lot since then. I mean, at the time you're busy, and you're scared, and you sing a freedom song, or there's a rally you go to, or something, and think about it in great detail. But I kept thinking, why was I so scared? Which made sense, but how did I deal with it? And how did the others deal with it? So I think that's important. And also, even here in California, talking to some of my friends who were in the early days of the farm workers, working in the valley. There's a lot of similarity to being in the valley and parts of California, what the farm workers went through, than what was happening in Mississippi. I mean, the valley, I don't know how much time people spent in the valley, it's really like another world from the Bay Area or Los Angeles or California we think about. And very rural, very conservative area, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, next period after 63, 65 was the period of 66 to 68. And that was the period of Black Power. And that was when Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks, after James Meredith had gotten shot, and James Meredith had been a student, the first black student at the University of Mississippi. He wanted to go and march, and he got shot, and walking down on the highway in Mississippi. Well, I mean, he may be Mississippi, that's no big surprise that he got shot. But the movement decided they wanted to basically take up that challenge. We're going to finish this march. So you had this march of people from all over the country come down. I don't remember the exact numbers, but they were a constant stream, walking outdoors, camping at different places that were familiar, where there were black farmers, particularly, where they could stay. And the part that got caught by the press was Martin Luther King and Stokely arguing about the merits of black power versus integration. And they had a good debate. And Martin Luther King was saying, I don't know about this black power. This sounds kind of racist, and it's only for black people, and blah, 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 blah. And Stokely, of course, would have his counter-argument. But the point I want to say, though, is that even though we had strong disagreements with Martin Luther King, and I don't know how many people have seen the movie Selma, which the Snick barely appears in, and where it does, it's a hatchet job. Two individuals who are always arguing with each other, and that's all Snick was. But we had respect for the application. We used to kid him and talk about him behind his back. We called him Dr. King this, and Dr. King that, and Dr. King this. Because that's how his associates would refer to him. They'd never say Martin or call him the Lord. Kind of southern slang for the Lord. Yeah, because he was a man of God, of course. Churchman. I might add, I mean, since folks don't know, being in the rural South, we adapted a lot, in trying to work and organize there, we adapted a lot of the manners. One of the things is we went to church. We basically used, wore our working clothes, were overalls, jeans overalls, and we had our blue work shirts. But on Sunday, we pulled off a white shirt, or ironed a white shirt, went out to church and got in the pews with the people and sang this different spiritual numbers. Because again, it's part of saying, we're not looking down on your culture. Some of this might be our culture. I mean, jazz, and gospels and stuff is the forerunners of jazz. And a lot of the modern music that we listen to today. So it's not a total separate kind of thing. And so, I guess I'm trying to say over and over again is how much the respect for the people, letting the people know if we were going to do something risky and ask them to do something risky, we were going to be right there with them. Because we didn't have a lot of money, we didn't have any army, even though the federal FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, came down, was spying to see if anything was happening to us. They were really more in helping the state police than they were helping us. So we didn't expect any help from there. So that would be even more true for the people who were trying to register to vote. And the vote was always something you really couldn't win. Whether you were, I mean, they had really things. They'd ask you, well, hey, you're a smart ass. You went to college, didn't you? You went to Tougaloo College. Okay. Look at this. This is a jar of beans. How many beans are in this jar? And whatever you guessed was wrong. Because they were the sole interpreter of the question, and so you failed the voter registration test. Or they would come up with some arcane paragraph from the Constitution of the state of Mississippi and say, well, could you give us your interpretation? And they'd usually ask this to somebody who could barely read. And of course, they would fail. So you could see how they'd go through the motions of opening up, and yes, come register. But then they do intimidation. Now, Annie Mae, you don't want me to tell your boss at your plantation that you're down here trying to register because you're hanging out with all these freedom riders, troublemakers. You don't want me to do that now, do you? Do you really want to vote? Because we'll give you the test, but we think you shouldn't do this. You should really go home and stay with your own kind and get away from all these freedom people from the north who are trying to cause you trouble. I mean, they do all kinds of things to intimidate people, some real, some imaginary. But, and that was part of the fear. Again, if you, went to register to vote, you could lose your land. Which is why we had these groups called Friends of SNCC around the country. These were mostly at college campuses and in different towns around the north. And like I said, they would raise food for people who actually tried to register and would get thrown off. They'd have a place to go, or they'd have food. In some cases, they sent down supplies. We got some help from some labor unions. The United Packing House Workers were in Chicago were very helpful, and so was the United Automobile Workers. Those were two unions that really helped us get supplies down. And the National Lawyers Guild was very good in terms of getting attorneys. Free attorneys, of course. People didn't have to hire attorneys. And to get people out of jail and struggle on. So anyway, so that was the 66 period. 68, we're still down there. And then the last period is from 68 to 1970. I'm going really fast here. This is the period that's one has to call the decline. A lot of people are burned out. They're leaving the South. Some are joining other organizations. The amount of people, black and white, that went through SNCC is amazing. People like Mario Savio came down in 1964, did voter registration, and went back, of course, to get active and be one of the founders of the free speech movement in Berkeley. A lot of the people who were early people in women's liberation also were a part of SNCC and played a major role. Some of the people who were active in the early gay liberation movement, Abby Hoffman and folks like that, became key. And so SNCC was in some ways a mother of a lot of other organizations or movements that would come out of that. Some of the Latino activists who formed the Young Lords, who were active in some of the Mexican groups out here, were part of SNCC or SNCC activity. And we tried to get alliances with other ethnicities, particularly ethnicities of color. This was the period when the third world concept was becoming very strong. And at a certain point in '69, SNCC became a third world organization. We changed our name to the Student National Coordinating Committee. Both a reaction to the whole questions on nonviolence and violence and the impact of Malcolm X on one hand, but also, and we wanted to keep the same initials, SNCC, but also that we wanted to be able to be open to other nationalities, particularly wherever you're working. We weren't trying to change SNCC from being a predominantly black organization, but in places like LA, where we wanted to work with Latinos, Chicanos particularly, and in parts of Puerto Rico, not Puerto Rico, yeah, we go to Puerto Rico. In parts of New York, different Puerto Rican groups, Asian and some Asian, Chinese American groups we worked with, that was important. And so let me get to two last things I'm going to just get into. Well, I'm going to scratch some of my book outline here. And talk about, the two things I want to talk about were, what were some of the controversies and stuff, so that people, the first one was the whole question of violence, nonviolence. And pretty much nobody was in favor of violence. You looked at the South, as like I said, they had the military, they had the court system, they had the law, everything. So the idea of doing something like a national liberation movement was not really in the works here. So, question, what do we mean by nonviolence? So it came down to two things. Were we philosophically for nonviolence as a basic way of living and doing everything, or we were for nonviolence as a tactical way of operating? And people fell down pretty much on those poles, and the minority, I think, of people who were instead were philosophically nonviolent. And a good example of that is John Lewis, who was the first, well, he wasn't the first chairman, he was the chairman for three terms, and now he's in Congress. And he was philosophically basically for nonviolence all the time. There are people, and I fall in this category, who saw this as the best tactic for basically engaging an enemy like we were facing in the South. In fact, we came up with a term called political jiu-jitsu, where you basically use the momentum and the force of the other side to help them throw themselves. Probably the most perfect illustration of that was in Birmingham, when people on TV all around the country could see Bull Connor turn his dogs and water hoses on high school students and say, well, this is the morality of the segregated South. And so people who were watching this didn't need to read a newspaper, didn't need to hear an analysis from somebody. They could see it with their own eyes. And I say this because that was one of the privileges that helped us succeed, where our generation had, because we had this new thing called television, which average people didn't have back in the 50s and the 40s and so on. And people could just turn on their knob and see what was happening all over. And so that was a major force that propelled our action. Another one which was important was that there was a Cold War going on between the United States, the arsenal of democracy and all good things, versus the bad communists. What Ronald Reagan would call it an evil empire. But as someone said, they were fighting for the hearts and minds of people in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and if those people saw the United States as the virtue of democracy, clubbing black people and sicking dogs on them, what would they think? And they would become very anti-U.S., which happened in many places. So we had some things beyond just our immediate organizing that were also propelling the struggle, keeping it in the news, keeping it moving forward, and keeping it out there. So the whole question of violence versus nonviolence, that was one. The second question, which I mentioned already, was were we going to be for direct action, or were we going to be for building political power through voter registration? A third one, can I read my own writing here? Came up in 1963-64. Well, the first one I mentioned about the nonviolence violence was at the very beginning of the organization. It was saying, how are we going to be? So that was like 1960 to 62 period. Voter registration was somewhere that became about late 62, 63, and got us into the voter registration period. The next period was started in late 63 and went through 1964, part of 65. Basically, it could be called, what's the role of white people in this movement? And it was mostly personified by the Mississippi Freedom Summer, where we brought in over 1,000 predominantly white students, mostly from very prestigious colleges, people who had families that were influential, and that could basically bring the struggle home to white America in a way that poor people from Mississippi couldn't do, or even an organization like SNCC could do. I mean, and looking at it from the hindsight, even probably not even hindsight, from that time period, we were using racism to fight racism. And in the sense that we knew that at that time, white people's lives mattered more than black people's lives. And so we had to influence the white people who had access to power, or if something happened to those white lives in Mississippi, that the government would have to get involved. And so that was always clearly a point. But it had downsides at the same time. A lot of the black staff who'd been part of SNCC thought they were being overlooked because all these new young whites came in who had skills that they didn't have because they went to Ivy League schools in many cases, and that we couldn't compete. I mean, almost, and this is still true in 2015, almost any kind of organized activity by white people
gets more attention than almost any kind of activity by black people. Yes, I mean, I lived in Oakland. I live in Oakland. I mean, the Occupy of Oakland existed in front of the city hall for as long as it did. If there were a bunch of black people there, I don't think so. I mean, Occupy Oakland had more black people than probably any Occupy in the country. But at the same time, is that it's predominantly white, and that the role of race, you know, was there a few years ago, and just like it was back in the '60s. So there was resentment coming after the Freedom Summer around that, and so when in '66 whites were asked to leave the organization, that was in some ways the result of that. And of course, a lot of white folks who had worked hard and struggled had been in the same situation. Many of them didn't like that. And we had said, you should organize in your own communities, the white communities. Now, I always thought that I was a little questionable about that part. And looking at the back, I think it was somewhat of a historical flaw to tell people they should organize in the white community. Not that it's necessarily wrong, but I mean, look at the white community and who organized the white community. I mean, the white community has a long history of social consolidation. And if we were telling some white people in Mississippi to organize in the white community, they're going to have to go against the Klan, White Citizens Council, Jim Eastland, the psychology of just about every white person in the state. And that's tremendous. And these are young people who, in case of SNCC, using the example, who haven't had any of that kind of experience. And even if they went home to Massachusetts or Ohio or Oregon or whatever, it wouldn't be maybe quite as stark, but it would still be like going up against the white establishment of their state. And you need a little preparation for that. And so you just can't throw people in the cold. So, I mean, I'm giving you my personal thoughts on the ramifications of that decision. And so, a lot of white people dropped out of the movement. They got into the anti-war movement around Vietnam, which was beginning to crest at that time. Some of them worked went to work in plants, industrial plants, and worked with labor. But by and large, there was not any major group of people who worked in the white community, except maybe at the level of middle class white. And those became more peace organizations or multi-issue organizations that came out, particularly in the 1970s. So anyway, so that was a key internal debate. We never really had a debate around black power. One, because so many people had left and were so exhausted. There wasn't the internal energy. I mean, black power seemed like a new energy. It seemed like it could organize people that we hadn't organized before. This was 1965, 1966, 65. We saw the Watch Rebellion go up around in Los Angeles. We saw before that the Harlem in 1964. Jaime probably had something to do with that. And by 67, I was in Newark when Newark went up, and I was there. And so we knew there was something different. So there wasn't a lot of ideological ferment against black power. But it was the question, what does black power mean? Now what happened is that because it became the hegemonic force in the black community for that period, other groups began their own definition of what black power was. Somebody said, look, it's really not black power, but it's green power by black people, which was basically capitalism. Even Nixon supported that, who was president. That's no green power. If that's what it's all about. So there are about 110 different definitions of black power. And even Stokely, who coined the term, if you look at his book, Black Power, which was written by Charles Hamilton, is a very kind of liberal interpretation of black power. It's well written, it's done, but it doesn't really do it to frighten anybody. But if you hear it give a speech, talking about flaming anti-imperialism, internationalism, basically freeing the third world, and black power was going to do that, then that's a different definition of black power. So we were kind of all over the map, but there wasn't really a real ideological debate around the black power in '66 around that. The next big debate we have, and I thought was one of the, it's hardly ever been recorded in terms of books, is that the 1967 SNCC staff meeting. It was a debate between Stokely, Carmichael, and James Foreman. And what the debate was about who makes history? Does an individual make history, or does an organization make history? And so, back and forth, Stokely was talking about the role of individual. He talked about how people like Ho Chi Minh were in the data on that. I was living at that time in the 60s in Newark, New Jersey, where I was working with a group called the Newark Community Union Project, which eventually became a SNCC project. And we used to go over to the United Nations, and then we actually got a non-governmental organization status at the United Nations. So we got to be there a lot, at least I was there at least probably on the average once a week. And I used to hang out a lot with the Algerians because they had fresh from their to Detroit, because he lives near the airport, the airborne. I could hop on the airline. And, but you bond, that's the main important. Spending time, learning what the different cultures are, watching particularly some of the folks from Yemen who were in Detroit, because they're dark skinned, and if they don't talk Arabic, you think they're African Americans. Because they've adopted some of the black styles, and I was there in the 70s, so they had these big Applejack hats on, platform shoes, walking down the street with the hustle, speaking Arabic. Okay, right on, yeah. So, I'm saying in the background, because in a lot of ways, politics is personal, and it's a part of your own development, who you get to know, and I didn't get a chance to go to Palestine itself until 1990. And I went to the Middle East Children's Alliance, a group that's based over in Berkeley. And we got to go both, it was right at the beginning of the first Intifada, and we got to go to both the West Bank and the Gaza area, and felt really blessed to see it. I mean, it was real. You read about it in the paper all these years, and all of a sudden, you're actually there. And because we had taken the stand for a long time, is that Zionism is racism, and we still, I would still argue that, is that we were welcomed a lot. I guess me particularly, because I found if I kept my mouth shut, you know, a lot of people thought I was Palestinian. I remember we were on a bus in Jerusalem one time, and the bus got stopped, and there were some Europeans on the bus, students. And they came, and the Israelis came and got them out, looked in the back of the bus, saw me huddled with a bunch of Palestinians who I didn't know. I was sitting in the back of the bus. And they just kept on going. They shut the door and took us to Ramallah, where we were going from Jerusalem. But, you know, and I got more of a sense of Islam also. I mean, both in the sense that I got to go to the Dome of the Rock and experience the religion. I got to spend a little time in the Armenian community, which, I mean, just this last week I was protesting and commemorating last Friday night in downtown San Francisco on the 100th anniversary of the genocide there. And I think it's interesting that two major countries don't recognize the Armenian Holocaust. One is the United States, one is Turkey, and the other is Israel. And I think that's an interesting statement in and of itself. So, we got involved a lot. I joined the Palestine Solidarity Committee here in the Bay Area. We put out a paper called the Palestine Focus. It used to be over when, what's that nice little store that people go to? Over by Division and Folsom?
Rainbow.
Huh? Rainbow. Yeah, it used to be when Rainbow was on 15th and Mission. And we had our office right upstairs. And so, but, you know, we were meeting people who were parts of, visiting from different Palestinian organizations. Get these initials right, PFLP, DFLP, other groups and stuff like that. So, I mean, I've always been, like Cuba, Maven was part of the Puerto Rico Solidarity Committee. I don't want to forget our major colony that we still have in the U.S., Puerto Rico. But I mean, Palestine's always been very special. And being there helped me make it more real. And so I love Rabab and like that. Is that enough?
Just say your name because.
Sure. Jaime. Well, first off, Phil, thank you for coming here. When I shook your hand earlier, I didn't realize which Phil I was speaking with, but
it's okay.
I appreciate all the work. I think the most pressing question on my mind you know, Stokely really opened my mind. I've read Black Power and Ready for Revolution, and he turned me on to Kwame Nkrumah, and Sekou Touré, and Jomo Kenyatta, and all the gang, you know, and which was really a mind-opening experience for me. But one of the things that, you know, I'm standing over in the Bayview right now, and there's one place that's come up also in West Oakland, and one of the things the split, the split between Panther-esque black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, I don't see, when I go through my community, I don't see, it's very hard to find tangible representations of Pan-Africanism. And I wanted to know your thoughts on the historical reasons for that, or what you see. Maybe you have a broader view of things that are happening around here in those terms.
Well,
Let's see if there is somebody else has
Sure.
a question related
oh, yeah.
to people.
Anybody have a related
Yeah,
question?
something like a related question, so we can, no?
Okay. What I would say, this is my personal opinion, is there's no base for Pan-Africanism in the United States. And people mean different things by Pan-Africanism. I mean, SNCC, because as I said, we had sent people to these newly independent countries. We had a Pan-African Skills project in both Uganda and Tanzania, and we basically supported African independence. We felt we were definitely Pan-Africans. But Stokely had a very specific definition of Pan-Africanism. And he felt that Pan-Africanism was basically should be the primary struggle for all people of African background in the world. And we didn't agree with that. And so it's interesting that Stokely is really well respected, loved in many cases, but in terms of people who follow his particular ideology, I mean, there's a group called the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which is the legacy. They're based over in Oakland, and they have African Liberation Day every May 20th or around that time period. Is they have a very small following, and they're not bad people or anything like that, but they don't have a really mass ideology, and also their practice has been, even starting with Stokely or Kwame Touré, remarkably, they don't like to call him Stokely. It's like he was 6 years Stokely, and then the rest of his life he was Kwame Touré. So why are we saying Stokely? Muhammad Ali could change his name, I can't Stokely. But I think their feeling is that, well, I think it's really hard to tell people that their struggle is somewhere else, first of all. And given that the African continent is not as united as we would like it to be united, under the original ideas of Kwame Nkrumah and African unity and Julius Nyerere, is that if it were a united place, we could say, then maybe that could be more of an argument. But right now, the basis, I mean, it was like Muhammad Ali said, America is the black man's battleground. And that's where we are. And I mean, there are Africans or African descendants all over the Americas, Latin America, Mexico. One of the things around immigration work we're doing, and my work group Baji, is we work with Central Americans, we work with black Brazilians who are here in the Bay Area, and people from Panama and other places who come from Latin societies but don't feel totally comfortable in Latin societies. They don't quite feel comfortable with African Americans either. So they're kind of in the middle, but they need someone who can understand their situation and listen to them and maybe, give them some ideas of how they can work around some of the broader struggles. But Pan-Africanism has not been, as it's been put out by Stokely's group or Stokely himself, has not been the catch-all for that because it's not local. In fact, this is one of the historic things of Leroy Jones or Miri Baraka. And when he broke with some of the more cultural black nationalists, he said, let's put down our roots right where we are, almost imitating Garvey in some ways, and saying, we are going to build, and he renamed the city, we're going to build a new arc, that's what he called it, and that will be the basis of black political power in New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey, and that's what we build on. We have alliances with folks in Africa that we like, and some people in Africa we don't like too well. given some of the governments there. But it's not just going to be this broad thing called Pan-Africanism. I don't know if that's helpful though.
No, very good.
Any other questions? Yeah, well, okay, so we'll take the two questions by Isaac and Ramses, and, yeah, okay, so why don't you start, Emilio, and then we will go to Isaac and then Ramses, and just ask the three questions and maybe.
When Black Power became a third world organization, when Black Power became a third world organization, did it weaken or did it strengthen the movement?
Well, you mean for SNCC?
Yes.
Well, it did both. In Newark, our frame was, we worked with Baraka, we had a Newark SNCC chapter, and we said our goal is to have a black mayor in Oakland, which we eventually accomplished in 1970. We worked with progressive black politicians. We weren't a whole lot, but there were some that we were working with. And so in that sense, it broadened our base. I mean, one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about is what was the role of SNCC in the black community, both in the early 60s and in the late 60s. And I would say the one thing that was interesting about Black Power, and not just for SNCC but for other groups, it was probably, I'm young compared to black history in the United States, obviously, is that it was the time that I remember where we had the force in the black community where the major energy was coming from. We had what social scientists call hegemony in many ways in the black community. Didn't mean we had all the positions, the mayors and the congress people, but basically people were swept by our vision. And because there was no real competing thing except to work in the Democratic Party, which a lot of people saw wasn't getting you very far and very much. And that would change as the 70s came. In fact, one of the, I'm just going to mention it, not go into the historic conference in Gary, Indiana in 1972, was where you had basically the community organizers and the activists of the 60s, and particularly the late 60s, who were meeting with the newly elected political congress people of the 70s, or the new mayors, and trying to form a black united front around a black power ideology. And that didn't work, it didn't happen, but that was the idea. But also because, in some ways, the grassroots community was declining in terms of our base, that we had, not just we, but the people who were part of the Black Power movement in the way that I've been talking about it, had less influence. We had influence, but less influence compared to the newly elected black officials that were coming out in the 70s. The important thing, though, to say here is, it has to do with SNCC, and the great historical error we made is that we gave up our community in the South to work in the North. And the North was quite different, and people moved around, they were influenced by different kinds of things like the automobile, where people in the South walked into a lot of things, particularly in the rural South. You walked and there was more local community, like in third world countries, is that, so we had a base, and we left that. The other piece which came from leaving that base, as we became more bombastic, studying in Stokely, is we were organizing for press, for the white press. And we would get covered. You know, you could say almost anything. In fact, people used to put on a black leather jacket or wear some shades, have a big fro, and you say, Black Power! And you're in a page. And that's intoxicating, you know, for a movement. You don't have to organize anybody. Yeah, we're organizing and trying to reach our people through something called the white press, the white mainstream press. Has some benefits, but by and large has major downfalls. That's what happened to SNCC. I mean, at least the Panthers, they had their own press. They could put out the Black Panther paper. They developed a national organization, where Weaver had been primarily a Southern organization and isolated and put in a few cities, thanks to the Friends of SNCC, and then some of the places like Newark, we decided to organize it. But so we got better known internationally. But at the same time, we lost a lot of our base. And so when one talks about what was the basis of the decline of SNCC, it was not that we should never have organized in the North. It was that we didn't bring the care to how to organize in the North in the way that we did in the South.
Isaac?
Yeah, I'm wondering, you talk about roughly 10 years of history in different periods, and I appreciate the way you talk about the different periods. And what I was hearing you talk about is these different internal conversations or struggles around questions of leadership or membership, and then also conversations and struggles amidst these very harsh conditions in the South in particular, and then in relationship to other organizations. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the changes or developments in the form of organization and how decisions were made, how leadership was developed, and these sorts of things, and how that grew and changed over time. I know it could be kind of a big question, but just...
Well, I think I got into that last question. We started organizing for the press. And not even our press. It wasn't like the SNCC paper or the SNCC newsletter. Or movement publications. I mean, we sent stuff off. I mean, of course, there was no internet and no blogs and things like that we do, like the movement communicates today. There was nothing remotely like Facebook we could use. And so, and we didn't have a lot of money because we were losing all these donors, and that was another problem. I mean, we're an organization talking about black power, and the base of our money comes from white liberals. And I mean, by and large, they were mostly principled. And it wasn't like they were trying to necessarily guide us, but at a certain point, if we did things like the case around Israel, and said that it was racist, a lot of folks go, "Hey, I can't support this organization any longer," and that happened. So we still, what SNCC was basically really well known for was people-to-people organizing on the grassroots level, knocking on doors, waiting. It influenced a whole lot of organizing in the North. And neighborhood-style organizing, but which usually, unlike SNCC, was not that political. So even like the Domestic Peace Corps, the VISTA group, they would go into areas in Newark and other places in the country and knock on doors and bring people to city meetings and so on, but there was no real politics in it. And but that's very people oriented, intensive, slow organizing. You sit in people's kitchens and have dinner with them and talk and wave. And it's great. I mean, some of my best times in my life has been spent in people's kitchens or in bars and talking to people and socializing with people and talking about politics and getting to understand how they talk about and how they think about politics and where we can meet. Because I am trying to push a set of ideas, not like this, but I'm trying to see where they're open to some of the things that we would want to talk about. And we get changed also in the process. And interesting, as a side point, I was reading this thing, I can't remember, I want to say it was from the late Saul Landau, movie filmmaker. He was talking about the Chiapas. And he talked about how people like Marcos went down to the jungles of Chiapas as intellectuals, academics, and they spent about at least 10 years there before they ever surfaced. And when they surfaced, they weren't the same people who came there. And also the Indians, the indigenous people who they met. I mean, there was a mezcla, a coming together of neither group. I mean, was coming together in the way that they had originally been. And the Indians had to accept them, and they had to accept the Indians. And out of that became the modern Chiapas movement. And that was the same thing in the South. I mean, that's why it's slow. And this is a society that's not very patient. Wait too long, and we don't want to be on hold, or we got so many things to do, and running around. That's urban life, and it doesn't fit that kind of organizing. So the question has been, still, how do you do certain parts of that? We can't do it exactly like we did in the South, because this is not the South. And this is also not the early 60s. I mean, we probably couldn't go back to the South now and organize the same way we did. And so what can we learn from that, and how can we figure out what were the key principles? And that will take us more into a future. I mean, it's kind of like, in a different example, is the Cuban Revolution right now. It's trying to figure out, now that they're working with an official opening to the United States, which has been trying to close them down for the past 50 years, is what of the Cuban Revolution do we want to totally maintain in terms of our socialist background? And what are we willing to, where are we willing to negotiate with the Western world, which is most of the world, which we're not. We're in a small country. And so, it's a similar kind of question. And the Cubans are facing it in a different context, but it's the same question. It's the same question.
Mrs.
I got two questions.
Two.
We have 2 minutes.
Quick. Okay. So speak about political jujitsu. Can you explain it more? Can you share some tactics of how that was used? And do you think that could work today? Right? And if not, why not? And another question is, what was the role of other people of color at the time, maybe in particular in relation to SNCC, and what did people think at that time? And I ask partially because in the more recent movement around Black Lives Matter, in the Bay Area, asking ourselves kind of what is our movement and now in which way, right? Yes, we are on the racism too, but this is a movement that's centered around Black Lives Matter. Right? So were there questions, anything like that, and what did that look like?
Well, let's try the second one first. I'm getting old, so remind me if I forget your first one. The black movement historically in this country, we feel, some of us feel, has always been the lightning engine for radical social movements in this country. And it doesn't mean that it's just exclusively black, but it basically means that in some ways because blacks have been enslaved, been at the bottom, and as a social group, that still a lot of the energy, it's why they're still killed the most by the police, or stopped the most by the police, that still continues to the present time. And the widest separation between the white mainstream and the other comes from the black community. That doesn't mean there aren't Latinos or Asians, and we look for allies. In fact, I always say, the thing that was so great about the third world concept, particularly as an African American, it was the first time that you had other people who were non-African, who understood something about colonialism, who understood something about imperialism, and even though there might be slightly different forms of organizing, they saw the black community as a real ally in that struggle. And that happened, that continued here in California, out of state, UC Berkeley, and the third world student strikes, but it happened internationally at the same time in terms of the role of Africa. And so I think that's still true. I mean, just earlier this month, I was part of a group that at the very conservative Asian Museum right downtown, we did a thing around Black Lives Matter with Asians and whoever else would show up. And it was quite a success. Everybody behaved. Huh?
The Asian Art Museum?
Huh?
Asian Art Museum?
Yeah, right down next to the library. Yeah, it was April 2nd. And because we realized the importance of Asian, well, any allies, but Asian allies particularly, because they really are staking stuff and they're looking at what's the future for them, as well as what has been the history of Asians. I maintain that you really can't understand California history and racism if you don't understand what happened to what Asians in the state. Because outside of maybe Native Americans, they bore the major burden of race historically in the state. So it's a national group. We have allies from some of the Southeast Asian groups, some of the Chinese American, Japanese American, and hoping that continue. We did I think I was a part of a rally of Black Lives Matter down at the Fed building in Oakland about maybe 2 months ago, where they chained themselves to the door, and it was actually for 4 hours and 28 minutes, because that was the time that Mike Brown was basically laying out and the police didn't bother them. I spoke, a bunch of other people spoke, and it was great. So we really welcome that those alliances, and we hope to work. The alliances you have to work to make sure they continue, because the other side is always looking for ways to provide economy. So the first question was?
Political jiu-jitsu.
Oh, political jiu-jitsu. I think that's always relevant. It's that where people who don't have much power, like us, we don't have the money, again, we don't have the state police or the state power for the most part, are going to have to find ways to struggle on. And as the surveillance state continues to get worse, the drones probably waiting right outside photographing people as we leave this place. Is we're going to have to figure out how to do that. And so how to use the power of the state against itself. And that, I always say, the biggest thing we got, two biggest things we have, is what's between our heads. And the second is that we work together collectively. We can't do it individually. And I think we can, Huey's a great phrase, the spirit of the people will conquer the man's technology. And that's a slogan, but I think in a lot of cases, if you work on it, and my example, I will say it, and there's there's going to be a conference coming up this weekend, May 2nd, around Vietnam. The Vietnamese. The Vietnamese have always been my heroes. Sorry about that. I mean, the Vietnamese have been my heroes. And because there is no way a country as poor by technological standards as backward as Vietnam should ever have been able to mount a serious struggle against the mightiest power on the world. And now they mount it, but win. And that's a lesson that we need to continually deepen and understand. And that's a perfect example at the world level of where the struggle of Vietnam, whether you went to Cuba, whether you went to Latin America, everybody was supporting in the 70s, 60s, 70s, the struggle of the Vietnamese people to get rid of the Yankee imperialists. And there was a reason, and they saw their own struggles. If the Vietnamese could win, we can win too. So that I think is very relevant.
So I want to thank because we were going to do it differently, but I think this was more organic and actually we benefited more. So you're staying with us until the end of the class, right?
Yes, boss.
Reality in this country is central to our understanding of political dynamics in this country. And I think if you remember last week's presentation on the Young Lords, on CASA, on the Latin American political process in this country, while we had our own specific realities, we were very much influenced and shaped by the dynamics of that period, and especially the Black Panther Party. And most of us modeled ourselves within that framework. Now, I want to connect our discussion today and bring it to the North, to my experience in the North, and I think many of us, and bring in a little bit of how this particular moment in history, how it also reflected itself. And if you remember, if you've read most of Malcolm made a very succinct remark in I forget which particular moment. He said, South, the Mason-Dixon line begins at the Canadian border. He did not define the South as the South. He said that all of America, all of the United States, was the South. And that was very important, and this was played out very clearly in the northern cities, in which millions and millions of black people from the South made the great migration to the northern cities, to Michigan, to New York, to Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston. And when they came there, yes, it was a very different reality than the complete Jim Crow, repressive apartheid laws in the South, but they also came to face a multiplicity of problems and conditions that also brought up the need to struggle, specifically housing, education, employment, and obviously just the whole question of the racist reality of many of these cities. And then white flight and how it impacted, and we see it here in Oakland, we see it here in San Francisco. Now, I wanted to bring just a point that also Phil touched on, and that is that many of the activists who went down to the South, the educational curriculum did not meet those needs. And that struggle led eventually to a very powerful community struggle in 67, 68 called Ocean Hill-Brownsville. And it became a powerful, emblematic reflection of the struggle across the East and the West Coast on the question of education, community control, jobs. And it was, if you look it up, Ocean Hill-Brownsville, 1967, 68, because I really don't have enough time to go into it, but it was fundamental. And it also was a point of serious division and contestation between the community struggles and the Jewish community, which dominated the teaching industry in New York, had attained a certain level of middle class upward mobility, and also had disconnected itself from the historical traditions of the Jewish radical left. And no longer, and had, by then, 67, 68, had shifted. Elements of the black community like Bayard Rustin, even unfortunately, A. Philip Randolph, wound up supporting because of the complicated complexity of unionism and union rights versus community control and class and race. In any event, I just want to read quickly how it impacted at the community level. And it was led primarily by mothers, Black and Latino, Puerto Rican, predominantly mothers, who were the ones that organized the struggle, took over the Board of Education. This was reflective and connected to everything else that was transpired, as Phil said. But I just want to quickly just to sum up, read remarks by oral history. And this also, personally, I can attest to this. I think I told you last week that, or in my paper, it says that, it was the period that I read the most. Once we started having the kind of curriculum and education, we started reading stuff that, like, pew! So this young girl, who changed her name to Karima, which has some connection with the Prophet, Karima Jordan, she was a young kid, she said, the police, the UFT, was United Federation of Teachers, the media, they taught us that we weren't worth anything. What the black teachers did was broaden us, our perspective of looking at things. We were no longer members of the small community called Ocean Hill, Brownsville. We were brought into W.E.B. Du Bois, his writings, Langston Hughes, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, A. Brown, Mao Zedong, the Red Book. I mean, we became international. And it was a good thing, because black people are the third world. 16-year-old kid at the time. The third world is much larger than European history. They brought us back to ancient African history. I mean, ancient world history, which didn't any longer start at Rome, which is what they used to teach us. That's all we knew. It started with Benin society, its melting of ore and silver and gold and things like that. We became much larger than just a community, and still today when I look at things, I look at it from an international perspective, and that was what these teachers taught us. And that is what that struggle, that period, and as Phil said, we viewed ourselves, whether we were enslaved, Black Panthers, Young Lords, Brown Berets, through the League of Black Revolutionary Workers. Wherever we were located in the U.S., in the smallest parts of the U.S., we saw ourselves as a world, in a world frame. We started viewing ourselves and connecting what was happening in the newly independent countries, in the struggle of Vietnam, in the struggle of Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and even in the struggles of workers in Europe. We started looking and linking. So you would have people that had never left the perimeters of this area, but they had a worldview. And this sort of like kind of reflected it. I wish I could talk a little more, but I also wanted to say that in the readings, we also illustrates the development of individuals and their connection to the struggle. The whole question of how Rosa Parks is more than that so-called isolated icon, and how she has been presented. It's much more. She was a reflection of the development and the context of the struggle. Claudia Jones, which many of you have probably never heard, who was a significant black political leader in the Communist Party, and it should be said, and it should be appreciated. Also, the grounds, as Phil said, we all are based on certain grounding, and the Communist Party, for all its deficiencies, and for all its historical problems, it made an incredible contribution in the struggle of black civil rights, if you just think about the Scottsboro case. So basically, I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we'll continue. Yeah, that's it. She already gave me the clock.
Okay, so I'm not going to shame you too much. Okay, so I have just one comment about what Jaime was talking about in terms of the Jewish community in New York. We can talk about, I don't want to talk about that too much next week, but I think one of the things that I don't think you meant to talk about the whole Jewish community. I think you were speaking about UFT, Shankar, and so on. I'm just, modifying what you were saying.
Yeah, but
What happened, I don't know if people know about this, but UFT, United Federation of Teachers, Al Shankar was the president at the time. And what he did is he actually put out flyers in the name of the black and Latino parents that were anti-Semitic.
Right.
They created and then they put them out. So to create a rift between the students and families on one hand, and then say that, you see, this is what they are nothing but anti-Semites, in order for, yes, Rich.
Oh, sorry, can you repeat his name?
Al Shanker, and I can give you it's actually, there is a book called Broken Alliances between blacks and Jews. It's written by Kaufman, who was a reporter for the Boston Globe, and one of the chapters is actually about that. It's very, very interesting. So, I mean, this is kind of another discussion. We can talk about that, but I think, I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, but I got it. You have to understand also, it was a reflection of the transition of a certain community, the Jewish community, from a working class basis into the upward mobility to becoming Americans, becoming within the mainstream, becoming white. And teachers reflected that. They reflected that. And not all of their own reaction, because 1/3 of the teachers supported the community. By the way, I should qualify that. 1/3 of the teachers broke with the union, crossed the picket line, crossed it and stayed with the community, especially the young, non-tenured white teachers supported the community. So I should make that clear. But there is a class, social dimension to why this came to be.
Just want to make sure that people understand you're not talking about core religion.
No, of course not.
Okay. Okay, so what I wanted, actually, I don't want to talk a lot, but there were some readings for our class today that have specifically speak about other ways in which the whole question of structural inequalities intersect with the questions of race, questions of class, and so on, and specifically the question of gender and sexuality. And one of the readings that you have is the one by the Combahee River Collective, which is, people don't know, one of the authors of the Combahee River Collective is today Ms. de Blasio, the wife of the mayor
In New York.
Like a lot of things get abandoned as people become higher up. So I think that's one of the things that we can talk about. And the other reading is the one by Angela Davis, in which Angela Davis specifically talks about the ways in which the development of reproductive rights, actually more than even right to abortion, and how it was really abused, and the sterilization abuse, which we talked about that last time. But specifically President Roosevelt, the early one, in 1906, said that white women will be engaging in race suicide if they do not have more children. And there was the statistics that Angela Davis gives in that. I think it's his chapter for all time. It's not something like that's written in that. It's excellent, because she talks about how many women have been, and I look it up in a minute and I'll find, well, we can talk about something else. How many women were sterilized, and then the role of the quote-unquote feminist movement. For instance, Margaret Sanger, who was supported by people whom we love, like Emma Goldman, for instance. And they started the eugenics movement in order to kind of like get rid of the people who are supposedly unfit. And there is also like the paupers, the prostitutes, the lepers, the people who are quote-unquote mentally retarded, and so on, to get rid of everybody else, but also to get rid of the people of color, in order to make sure that there is a white majority. So this is, and this links up, if we go into, when we talk about Puerto Rico last time, we talked about indigenous people, the whole, like the sterilization abuse of indigenous women, or the African Americans. When we talk about Palestine next week, one of the biggest issues of the Zionist movement is quote-unquote the demographic problems. Like, how can they make sure that they keep the numbers of the Palestinians low in order to maintain quote-unquote Jewish majority within Israel. So this is something that's always been strategically related to. And this is one of the issues that I had this when I was commenting on yours. I should not have the okay. So that was one of the things that I thought, yeah. And I think in terms of like, I want to also say a few things about the whole question of the women's movement, the ways in which the U.S. women's movement gets told. Did I speak about that? No. So the way in which the U.S. women's movement attributes its beginning to the Seneca Fall Convention. I mentioned Seneca because that's the name of the indigenous people there, right? But this is Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And there was another person who was involved with them, who was Ida B. Wells. I only have 5 minutes, I just started talking. Later to the women's rights movements and so on. And so this is the question that comes up until today. What is it that you're working? How feminist are you? If you are only focusing on questions that are not necessarily only gender-based, because what they were white, middle class, or upper class, hetero, Anglo women who were part of the settler society, right? And they were actually saying that then the issues of lynching or so doesn't concern us. There was also a big debate between these women who wanted suffrage voting rights and Frederick Douglass, who was saying, why do we have to say it's flip a coin, either women or blacks? Why can't everybody get the voting rights? And the white women's movement actually opted to only ask for voting rights for white women without black men or black women and so on. So this is kind of like a very, and it continues until today. If you think about the way in which the narrative of the women's movement in the United States, the master narrative, if you take any introduction to women's studies classes, a lot of the times they begin with the story with Seneca Falcone, this is like where it began, right? And then they say in the 60s women went back to work because this is what Betty Friedan talked about in the feminine mystique and so on, right? White, it's middle class, upper class, white women in the suburbs who went up to work because they got bored with their lives. This is what happened, right? But this is the way the story gets told. And then people start talking about the contestations. Then they say, and there is black women's feminism. And there is Patricia Hill Collins who talks about black feminist thought. And there is the Latina women, and then throw in Sherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldo. And so they give you a little bit contestations. But the story remains, the main story, the dominant narrative remains the narrative of the ways in which white women tell it. So I think this is one of the things that we can think about specifically in the presence of somebody like, the writings of Angela Davis and giants who've actually moved the field and basically undermine all of this stuff. How do we even talk about it without starting the story from the dominant narrative that's settler? The other thing that I think about that when we're talking about African American liberation, black liberation, is to think about the question of indigeneity. To think about the question of indigeneity. And there is a lot of discussion today. The most recent discussion in the field today is what people talk about is settler colonialism and anti-black racism. So rather than saying racism means anti-black, you talk about anti-black racism that actually talks specifically about racism that's directed against black people, because there are other ways of discrimination and racism that are practiced against other people and so on. And the ways in which we can connect the understanding of indigeneity, of indigenous people's rights, who are the original people of these lands, and the relationship with the African American community. And I want to, I need a couple of minutes to be able to develop that, even if I didn't say anything else. Because I think a lot of the times, and we will talk about this next week too when we talk about Palestine, but I think it's really important to think about that. A lot of the time people think about all settler colonialisms are the same. So they're all the same, and then all the other people in settler colonial states are the same. And we talked about it a little bit when we discussed arrivants, the Jody Baird term when she was talking about settler colonialism that Scott Melkinson was quoting. That how do you understand the presence of the African American community in the United States? African Americans did not up and pick and say, okay, I would like to, immigrate, I'm going to get on the Mayflower and I'm going to end up in the United States. Then people were kidnapped and they were enslaved. Right? So that kind of relationship does not, when we do comparative studies, when we do comparative settler colonialism, it's very important not to collapse what happens, for instance, in Australia, which was a penal colony, right? What happens in Israel with the Jews from Arab countries is not the same as the experience of African Americans in this country. It's really important to think about it, and it's really important to be able to account for settler colonialism and indigenous people's lives, as well as what happens to African Americans, which is a different experience. And that's why it's really important to think about anti-black racism, settler colonialism. So we're not erasing or collapsing any people who are part of it. And think about every community of color in this country, whether we talk about what happened to Asian Americans, and this is like some of the readings we have this week. There is no week on that, which is, we apologize for that, very short course, but to think about some of the writings, for instance, by Diane Fujino about Aoki and Yuri Kuchiyama. And what happened with not only with the Chinese Exclusion Act and with the importation of workers to build the railroads and to actually build, industrialize this country and so on. And keep in mind how Marx referred to the Egyptian mode of production and the people who were actually industrializing this country. That's another discussion, political economy. But to think about that and to think about what happens also to the Japanese people during the Second World War who were placed in concentration camps. 1/3 of them were non-American, but the rest were actually US citizens. And what was the relationship of the US leftist movement? And this is where, like, Fujino particularly emphasized how the Communist Party of the United States failed in that, and the reason, and part of it failed part of it is because of this excessive, they call it nativism, I think it's xenophobia. I mean, let's call it what it is, racism and xenophobia, and basically over-belonging to the United States, a country that actually does not even want them, right? But part of it also is what happens during the 50s, the whole question of the witch hunt and the McCarthyism during the 50s that basically destroyed the communist movement, destroyed the leftists, and then you also have at the same time Cold War rivalry going on at that point, which makes also the Communist Party being very much loyal and pledges allegiance to the Soviet Union and the socialist countries. And then, so at that time, the victory against fascism, victory against Nazism becomes the most important thing, the most overarching goal, to the exclusion of what happened to the Japanese Americans during the Second World War, or the racism that was going on, the GIs who were from color, soldiers of color who will go and die and defending or fighting for this country, and then they come back and find the racism going on. So how do we think about that? And then that leads us to the article by Robin Kelly, Black Like Mao, who talks then about why is it that black radicals in particular start actually gravitating towards Maoism, because at that time Mao and China, Mao's China, was actually supportive of liberation movements all over the world, while the Soviet Union was sort of like, not as solid. It was supporting some liberation movements. There is a whole argument by Lenin why they supported national liberation movements, and when he debates with Rosa Luxemburg, but I was going to put it next week, but Jaime said we should not put it out there. But there is a whole discussion, why is it that communist groups in particular supported national liberation, what they supported and how they supported and so on. But at that time, China was all out to support all national liberation, including a black liberation movement in the United States. So they supported civil rights, they issued statements against racism, they took in people, fugitives who were running away, Robert Williams. And so this explains to us why people gravitate there, but also because China also was a third world country. So third worldism, taking the term third world, which was at one point kind of like supposed to be derogatory because there is first world, second world, and then third world, and claiming it and basically saying that we are third worldists, which is also the same struggle that happened at San Francisco State, and this is the second chapter, the other chapter of Beyond This, which she talks about the whole struggle, because I think the first chapter talks not about SNCC, which Phil has elaborated on, but the second chapter is the ways in which the discussion then turns into the students start identifying with the third world. And why is it that they identify with the third world? What does it mean to identify with China? What is it to identify with the third world? There's internationalism and transnationalism in that one, but there is also the question is that we don't belong to America that is being given to us. We actually belong to a different kind of imaginary, a different world imaginary that's very liberatory, emancipatory, and so on. And within that, are you raising? No, you're not. And within that, the question, the discussion around, and I just want to come back like one, bring it back to the question of gender and the question of feminism and so on. And I raised this last time. We can continue talking about it. But I think there is this whole, the way the narrative is told, and with Garvin and I think Denise Oliver, their lives do not tell us the story that women get involved and then they become, the feminist consciousness rises, and then all of a sudden they become feminists, and then all the men are sexist, and all the men are horrible, and and every single man hates every single woman. So it's very binary, it's very essentialist, and so on. The lives that we're studying actually tell us a different story. And if we want to, and I think in order for us to be able to relate to the story that we are told by Angela Davis, by the Combahee River Collective, Denise Oliver, Garvin, Rosa Parks, Claudia Jones, and by but if we look at their lives, actually their lives do not fit this very linear narrative that we are told about. If we think about middle class or upper class, hetero, white women who have a particular trajectory of how a movement, and everything is organized very neatly because the brain has only one compartment. You cannot be more than one thing at a time. Jaime mentioned intersectionality, which is the framework that Kimberly Crenshaw came out with in 1991. There have been critiques of intersectionality. The good thing about intersectionality is that it actually allows for multiple systems of oppression and multiple possibilities of liberation. Okay, I have a problem with it because I don't think everything intersects at one particular point. I mean, there is overlapping, embeddedness, messy. Social life is very messy. That doesn't really work the way it is. So I think we need to we don't need to be thinking about how the dominant frameworks give us ideas of oppression and explain the oppression and give us ideas for liberation. We can actually say things do not fit that way. Not everything has to be on flat or what is it, what do you call it? Two axis of or even the three or whatever, X, Y, Z. No, you don't have to. Life is much more complicated than that. And our lives, even as we study them and we study the communities we work with, I mean, like what Phil was saying about the people in the South, you go and you find out that what you are saying is sort of really doesn't, whatever you want to think about, doesn't really work very well. And the same thing we saw last week with the young lords going to Puerto Rico and thinking, okay, now we have the recipe, we're going to really have the recipe for liberation. Same thing with the international solidarity movement going to Palestine, thinking, land in Palestine, all of a sudden you're going to have liberation and so on. Things don't work that way. Things require much more work, much more grassroots, much harder. Things do not happen immediately. There will be many, many things before things succeed. So I think I'm preaching that, thinking, getting away from this sort of binary or flat or collapsing mechanism to think about the complexity of social life. And I'm going to stop.
Any questions? It's getting late, but any other thoughts on our remarks?
We didn't talk about Fanon and why everybody was reading Fanon. I mean, everybody was reading Fanon.
There's a lot that we are not able to cover.
Amazing.
I would like you to really critically look at Malcolm's message to the grassroots and Martin Luther King's speech on Vietnam and letter from Birmingham, and look at it critically and think in terms of that argument that Malcolm was the hardline and Martin was the moderate. And is that true? Especially when we think about Martin Luther King at the end of his life. His involvement in the Memphis strike, his on Vietnam. And today everything is all him being, everyone. But in the last year of Martin Luther King, he was an isolated man because of that stand he took on Vietnam. Because he said it right on he talked about economics, imperialism, violence, the greatest purveyor of violence, the U.S., imagine. He said it. And many of his collaborators, much of the money shrunk. Much of his so-called institutionals, church elements, withdrew. And now everybody claims it afterwards. So when you look at it, you'll see, for example, different language, different emphasis, internationalism, third worldism, militarism, defiance, justice. You'll see the threads between Malcolm's message to the grassroots and Martin Luther King's latest speeches at the end of his life. You'll see that in many ways there was a convergence, even if they were coming at it from a different perspective of whether you accept the framework of the nation state, whether you accept the framework that we want to be included in the dominant society or we do not want to be included. But at the end, they both said that the struggle of African Americans was not a civil rights struggle. It was a human rights struggle. They both said it at the end. And when we were young, we didn't see it. I was all down with Malcolm, 100%. And my sister-in-law recently asked me about it. We had a very good discussion because she remembers me being Malcolm. Right? So, so I don't know if Phil has any last words on that. I would like you to think about that. It's an important thing.
Well, I was just going to say that I think one of the things that we learned in our struggle was that things change in terms of terms. And I remember growing up as a young man, and the question was, are you for separation or are you for integration? And that was the kind of the alpha and the omega of the black struggle. Two state or one state. Right. And at a certain point, what we realized is that the real division was between what we called the resistance pole and the accommodations pole. That's right. And because we understood that the enemy was the state itself. And therefore, whether you were there were integrationists who were radical, and there were integrationists who were accommodations. They were separatists who maybe shouted loud about separation, but basically were on the payroll of the U.S. government. And so they could move. So that was the wrong terms. And so you're looking where the action is and where the energy is coming for change. That's where the key point is.
Yeah, actually, I want to add something to this because this relates to actually you asked the question next the first week. It's not because you're only here today, but it came up because this is in Fanon and it's also in the stuff we read, and it speaks exactly to what Phil is talking about. So in the beyond this chapter about not just San Francisco State, she talks about also UCLA and what happened. At that point, Maulana Karinga was presenting himself as the most radical person to the most cultural nationalist. He's the one who started Kwanzaa and so on. It was people from his organization who killed two of the Panther people, whether they were infiltrators through the FBI or they were whatever happened, but they actually objectively contributed to the division of the movement and the destruction of the movement, which takes us to Fanon and the discussion about internalized colonialism and how people really, one of the basic battles that any movement needs to do is to struggle against internalized colonialism. And it's a very difficult struggle because that is something that we breathe, the air that we breathe, everything we read, this is the environment we live in, so it's much more difficult. It's one of the hardest things to struggle with. And one of the easiest things to do is to start labeling people as accommodationists, sellouts, whatever, and so on. But maybe kind of like, if we're thinking about movement building, maybe one of the ways to think about that who draws the continuum? Who is the one who's telling the story? Goes back also to our discussion. Who tells the story? Who is saying who's moderate and who's sellout? I mean, like even when they say good Muslims and bad Muslims, who's saying good Muslims and bad Muslims? Talking this on TV, the U.S. government, the quote-unquote anti-terrorism people, and so on. It's not the communities. It's not people from the community, and it's to kind of like before we start labeling people in order to distance them from the movement, to think about how can we build. And I'm not talking about like everybody stands together, sings kumbaya or whatever, but to actually think about how do we deepen the struggle in the long term. How do we get to the point where actually strengthening ourselves, deepening, and there are some battles that are like really not worth fighting, and some battles that are worth fighting. And in that sense, one of the major battles that we need to fight is to get rid of the internalized colonialism, to struggle against it. We may not be able to get rid of it completely. Fanon has a recipe for that, but that's another thing. We're not talking about it. Okay, but to think about how to do it.
I just wanted to time check. We have 15 minutes until 9:30, which is the last time that we said.
So we can, if people want to take questions,
Take
people
questions,
can leave,
please.
or comments or
There's
discussion.
also a question on that, just so you all know.
There's a question here.
On the posted.
That's a question?
Yeah.
So maybe we can
agree
start,
on that.
take the floor questions.
Okay. Oh, I don't know if I need the mic.
Oh, no? Okay.
Yeah. When you're talking about internal colonialism and internal settler colonialism, I'm wondering in the past few weeks, I think, I come from immigrants, And I think the case of immigration to the U.S., especially, more in the last few decades, is different when you're talking about internalized colonialism, because people a lot of times did choose to come here. And so there is very much this idealized vision of what the U.S.